Welcome to your daily dose of Star Trek, a collaboration between Maggie and I of Married with Comics and Layne from Batman books, The Dark Knight In Prose. Where we take turns reading chapters from Diane Duane's The Wounded Sky. Chapter 6. Jim called the bridge from the turbo lift to give the order for affected crew to report to sickbay. When he came off the all-call channel, Uhura said to him, "Captain, Mr. Spock has called in with a status report on his checks. He'd like to see you at your earliest convenience." The lift slowed and stopped on deck 4. Spock looked at Jim. "You go ahead," Jim said. "Catch Bones before the rush starts. I'll be along." Spock nodded and stepped out of the lift. "Engineering," Jim said. When the lift doors opened again, Jim saw with mild amusement that there were crewmen running all over the department, up and down between the various levels, looking slightly frantic. It wasn't a good sign. There was probably something wrong with the engines, but Jim had always found it a little funny that Scotty's crews picked up and expressed the exasperation Scotty hardly ever let out. He walked in and heard Scotty's voice and Kittlick's chiming echoing up from one of the lower levels. Jim headed down toward them. "No, Montgomery, let's try it this way. There are 3 physical dimensions, right? Each generated out of the one before it. Of course there are more, but we're working with a tridimensional paradigm for the moment. It's easiest to handle. So, length, breadth, height, or depth. Now, once you postulated physical existence, you can also have motion through it. That's what we use to define the next function. Time. Right. There are 3 dimensions of that too. And again, potentially many more, each also generated by the one before it. In the 3-dimensional paradigm, those are inception, duration, and termination. Or you could call them creation, preservation, destruction. All right so far? Good. So once you've postulated physical things and time, then the physical things can begin affecting one another. So there's another set of functions for which your physics doesn't seem to have precisely congruent terms. You could call these functions aspects of relatedness. The closest equivalents in your language would be affectedness, effectiveness, and cause. Wait a minute, lassie. I thought cause came before effect. Sometimes it does, but I wouldn't depend on it. There was a pause. "I think you lost me again." "Me too," Jim said, coming down to their level on the little raised lift platform. "Captain," Scotty said, sounding slightly relieved that the lesson had been interrupted. "I did not think you'd be down here so soon." Trouble for sure, Jim thought, hearing the brogue so thick. "Engine problem, Scotty?" Look here." Scotty stepped over to a console, keyed it for structural analysis readout, and moved a little to one side so that Jim could see. "There's a weak area in the port nacelles interaction confinement vessel. I didn't know for sure when we picked it up, though odds are as good it was doing that crazy .9C dump Mr. Sulu put us through. What bothers me, though, is that the damage control computers did not pick it up." Jim looked at the readout, a graphic of a microcrystalline X-ray scan of the nacelle, and nodded. He kept his external calm, but inside he shook. The super-hard iridium-rhodium hull plating had simply begun to unravel. Millions of the bonds of its single long-chain crystal were shattered so that there was a huge crack-shaped weakness right down to the nacelle's length for many meters. "If we try to go into warp with that the way it is," Jim said almost absently, "we'd be so much space dust right now." "Aye, Captain." Jim turned away from the readout. "How long will it take to fix?" "Not much longer than the original estimate. We'll have to go out and reweave the metal, but we're equipped for that. Meanwhile, I'll have other checks running. And Captain, if I may say so, best you have the computers looked at too. Damage control should never have missed that flaw." "I'll speak to Mr. Spock." Jim reached out and patted Scotty on the shoulder. Well done, Scotty. You keep listening to your hunches on this trip. That I will, sir. And how about you? Jim said, looking down at Kittelick. Is the drive repaired? Indeed, yes, Kittelick chimed. It was a half-hour's work, if that. The relationship equations were biased by the nova towards increased effectiveness, that's all. Right, Jim said hurriedly. Save it a second. Scotty, I forgot to ask. While we were in transit, did you have any odd sensations, experiences? Scotty looked at Jim in a mixture of relief and alarm. Aye, he said in the voice of a man telling the strict truth and wishing he could do otherwise. But I didn't think it was anything serious. Neither do I. Still, go see Dr. McCoy. Everyone else will be too, I think. Best get there early and avoid the rush. And have any of your crew who are affected get down there too while they can. Some of them have gone already, sir. We heard the order. As soon as my crew chiefs have the relieving well underway, I'll go up myself. Good. As you were then. Scotty headed off, shouting energetically for one of his lieutenants. Jim watched him for a moment in satisfied amusement, then glanced down at Kittelick. You two seem to be getting along well. He is one of the best Terran engineers I've met, she said, and I have met quite a few. He seems to have mastered the knack of truly seeing other species designed from the inside, which is a rare gift. His interest in my people's physics is a symptom of that, I think, and he cannot stop wanting to know. It is an honorable trait. The ship is full of honor, then, Jim said a bit dryly. They began to stroll through the engineering together. Did you notice any effects during transit, Commander? She shook herself, making a chiming shrug as she picked her way delicately along beside him. No, I seem to have missed the excitement again. I think my species must be either resistant or blind to the effect. None of my Hamalki colleagues ever mentioned any such occurrence during the tests. The Terrans sometimes seem shocked or surprised after inversion, but that always passed quickly. None of them ever mentioned experiencing anything peculiar, and the Vulcans show no sign of any problem at all. Like Spock on the bridge this morning, Jim thought. Walk down to sickbay with me if you're free, Commander, he said as the engineering doors slid open for them. Certainly, but Captain, feel free to call me by my name, unless you think it will compromise discipline among your officers. Oh, discipline must be maintained at all costs, Jim said, doing his best to keep his face straight. Kittelick jangled at him, the sound Jim was coming to recognize as laughter. Captain, she said, sounding quite dry, do you think I was hatched yesterday? I don't know what to think about you, Kittelick. I haven't spent that much time talking to glass spiders. What's this crazy stuff you're trying to get Scotty to swallow? She began telling him. Jim had, of course, done the required reading in the non-causal scientists and the philosophical scholia of pure physics while in academy. Though the subject had confused him at the time, and he hadn't seen the worth of it, Jim had sopped up the information, used it to pass his tests, and forgotten about it. Kittelick's explanation, unfortunately, began where Jim's limited understanding of the non-causals ended, and became practically unintelligible within minutes. So Jim just kept nodding, certain that stopping her to ask for explanations would only make things worse, and resigned himself to simple fascination with something and someone so alien. When they finally reached sickbay, Jim glanced in just long enough to see the place was packed full of crew, with more arriving every moment. McCoy and Chappell and other members of the medical staff were sitting around at terminals or with datapads on their laps, talking to crewmen and taking notes at top speed. It was obvious that McCoy wouldn't have a report for him for some time, so Jim simply kept walking, listening to Kittelick expound on universal gender and radicals of causation and Taub nut universes and space knew what else. She was a welcome relief from what would have otherwise been another one of those periods during which a captain can do nothing but wait. Eventually, they wound up in Jim's cabin. Ah, the spot famed in song and story, she said, looking around her as he bowed her in. One of Jim's eyebrows went up as he headed for the Saurian brandy decanter. Kittelick, do you partake? For flavor only. Alcohol doesn't affect my metabolism. To get drunk, we eat polycarbons. Graphite, I think Montgomery called it. Here you are, then. But how are you going to... Jim stared at the crystalline leg with which she reached up and took the glass. You didn't have claws at the end of that a moment ago, he said accusingly. I didn't need to, said Kittelick, delicately up into one of Jim's easy chairs and tucking her legs in around herself. She held the drink up close to her right side. That looked odd, but odder still was the imbibing organ she extended from her side and dipped into the snifter. She began sipping, making bubbly noises like a child with a straw in a milk container. "So, Captain," she said with perfect clarity once she drank, "how many of those rumors are true about how you spend your evenings here?" "Madam," Jim said, unoffended but very amused, "not as many as I wish were true. Besides, what would you do if I asked you about your sex life?" "I'd tell you." Jim did his best not to choke on the brandy. "I thought they always taught at Starfleet Academy that the two things you shouldn't discuss with aliens just on general principles are sex and religion." "We must have studied at different branches of the Academy, Captain. They told us not to mention death and taxes." "There you go mentioning them." Kittleek shrugged again, chiming. "One of them doesn't apply to either of us," she said. It was true. Starfleet personnel were tax exempt. "And the other?" "I don't pay taxes," she said. The conversation kept going that way, veering from the commonplace to the incomprehensible and back again. Through it all, Jim was fascinated by the perception that this was a peer who had nevertheless surrendered herself by pleased choice to another's command, a phenomenon he had gotten used to in his Enterprise crew, but saw much less frequently outside it, less frequently still in a species so far from the human. Kittleek's unflagging energy fascinated him too. Mostly it expressed itself as delight in whatever was going on. Even when the discussion turned to death and destruction, as it did once or twice, Kittleek never descended into anything like human seriousness. Earnest, lively opinion tinged softly with affectionate anger was as close as she got. Jim began to think it sounded like fun to be a glass spider, and finally told her so. Just a touch of sobriety crept into Kittleek's voice when he said that. "I don't know if your pleasure in infinite diversity would stretch that far, Jim," she said to him. He had long since offered her his given name, and hadn't turned made free of one of her interior syllables. "You seem to enjoy the extracurricular things that happen in this cabin. If you were a Hamalki male, you would enjoy them once." So I know I shouldn't." She laughed at him. "Jim, we've already survived discussing the horrors of death and taxes. Could discussing what remains be any worse?" And she began to explain what she meant by the remark about Hamalki males, for which Jim was glad. He was genuinely curious. Nature had presented the Hamalki with an interesting problem. Reproduction in their pre-sentient days had been a haphazard and frightful business, a given male fertilizing as many females as he could before being devoured by one of them in the nuptial act. Slowly, though, as sentience set in, the Hamalki began to notice something, that the hatchlings of those females who ate their males prospered, growing faster and stronger than the children of Hamalki females who didn't. It wasn't until much later that their scientists discovered the cause. The enzymes and hormones present in the male's body during mating caused the female's analog to DNA to split and recombine with the male's in new and more effective ways. But by the time this came to light, the Hamalki had for thousands of years surrendered to the bare fact and surrounded it with custom born of civilization and the high emotions. Courtships had become an ecstasy of weavings, physical, vocal, and intellectual, as the two participants consciously and unconsciously determined what genes to share, how much memory to perpetuate, what of themselves to keep. A mating pair would sing visions and trade desires while jointly building the edifice that would serve both as a statement of what they had been and the nest for their mating. The climax of the nest weaving, as it were, the written confirmation and completion of their relationship, which triggered the act of love directly. Just after his ecstasy's height, when the enzymes were in full flow, the male would initiate his own death by biting the female and causing her, in her own throes, to blindly attack, kill, and devour him. Jim sat still for a while, dealing as best as he could with his own reactions. "Surely, though," he said eventually, "you don't have to do it that way. You're advanced enough to have synthesized the enzymes." "It has been suggested," Kittleek said, rearranging a few front legs as they hung down over the front of the chair. "It caused a few holy wars." "There I go again," he said. "Religion. Sorry." "No offense taken, Jim. You have religions, though, that offer participation in miracles of various kinds to their celebrants. One of them, I understand, offers you the opportunity to eat God. I was surprised to hear about that. For some of our people say that's what we're doing. No matter. How would the celebrants of that miracle feel, do you think, if you told them you could cause the transubstantiation in question to occur in a test tube without recourse to the deity involved? Jim shuddered. We did have some problems of that general sort a while back, he said, but they didn't last more than a century or so. I seem to remember that several religions got expanded a bit to take into account some of the new things the universe had been proven able to do. Kittelick laughed, reaching over with one free leg to touch Jim lightly on the forearm. Typical, she said. That's a vertebrate civilization for you. My people are a little more rigid. She sipped at the brandy again. The other part of the problem is that there's something else passed along in the act that the enzyme doesn't supply. Now Kittelick did sound serious, though not sorrowfully so. Ghost, she said. Jim was perplexed for a second. Then he got it, and had to keep himself from smiling. He wasn't sure how well Kittelick could read human expressions. Spirit, you mean, the soul. That's right. It has to be transmitted somehow, after all. She began fiddling with her front legs. Jim looked at the moment curiously and then realized with a slight shock that she was spinning. A bright, glittering filament stretched from a tiny orifice on Kittelick's belly to her claws, and with 4 of her front legs she was shaping and interlacing it, weaving a structure as delicate and fragile looking as spun glass, or a spun thought. "I am Mr. Kurt," she said, working absently while she talked like someone crocheting. "My mate the last time out. We knew each other for 100 years or so before we decided that it was time to share the act. It doesn't seem like enough time, though. He was an architect. He constructed the most elegant structures and sentences and emotions. And I used to pretend I knew nothing about architecture itself, so he'd come visit and lecture me on it." She laughed. "He's probably the reason I found myself working on Starbase 18's design team. His old memories woke up in me. I wove 2 of his syllables into my name this time out." She busied herself with her knitting for a moment. "He's in me still, of course," she said after the pause. "We store the enzyme and the male seed for as long as we want to. I could have a little Tukur at any time, but it wouldn't quite be him. It wouldn't be the same, and I would sooner turn time back and have him again. But he'd say that was silly and laugh at me." There was another pause. "I begin to see now," Jim said, "why your people are such great builders." "Oh, yes. Building is love for us, literally. Every edifice is a reflection of the one we will build out of love or have built already. And besides, the price of our lives and our loves is death. The payment's dear. Love and life and the vision that grows out of them both have become precious to us. Not just ours, everybody else's too. So we serve those others. We serve you, building and making. Doing that, seeing your desires achieved without your dying, we conquer death a little. And being the answer to others' questions is sweet." The communicator whistled. Jim reached out to the controls on the table. "Kirk here." "McCoy," said the familiar voice, sounding no less disgruntled than before. "We're cleaning up down here, Jim. Do you want to stop in?" "On my way. Out." He turned to Kittelick, who was finishing the delicate structure she had begun, a spiky, interwoven mass full of absent-minded symmetries. One foreleg sliced the slender cord that still attached it to her, the other 3 offered it to Jim. "I'd best go see what Montgomery is up to out there. Not that he's not competent, but we did invent the crystal weaving process for starship hulls, and if he's found some way to improve on it, I want to know." Jim took the sculpture and put it up on a shelf out of harm's way. "Tell me if he has, and thank you. Meanwhile, let's move. Bones sounds like he's at the end of his rope." Sickbay was somewhat quieter when Jim got there. Most of the crew people were gone, except for a few sitting about and still talking to people from medicine or to one another. Off to one side, Christine Chappell was having an earnest, frowning conversation with one of the diagnostic computers. It was answering her questions much more calmly than she was posing them, which, as usual, was not improving her temper. "There you are," said a voice behind Jim. McCoy was standing in his office door, talking to a little dark-haired woman Jim didn't recognize. "Come on in, Jim." We haven't met, Jim said to the new crewman as he went to where she stood with McCoy, taking the opportunity to look her up and down. She stood straight and slender in fleet nursing whites, with the serpent and lightning rod insignia of the first in-services at her collar. Jim wondered briefly what someone used to the rough conditions and frightful medical challenges of the frontier worlds would make of those comparatively sedate nature of starship duty. He had little time to think of anything else as he noticed that he was being looked over as well. Sharp hazel eyes and a calm face glanced down the length of him and paused, rather annoyingly, to consider his midriff and the 2 extra kilos that had lodged themselves there while Jim was waiting for word to come in about the drive. Then those eyes flicked up to meet his again, and there was a laugh in them as their owner read both Jim's mild chagrin and his resolution to do something about the 2 kilos. "Sir," the nurse said, taking the hand Jim offered her, "Lieutenant Commander Leah Burke. I'm very pleased to meet you." "Yes," Jim said. "Welcome aboard. Did you have time to make your goodbyes on Terra? You were pulled off leave rather short notice, I understand." "There were no goodbyes to make, sir. I am Earth-human by derivation, but home for me is Saint-Amandien. I was just taking a couple of weeks' vacation." Jim considered that anyone who would choose to live with the Mahmedier surrounded by semi-extra-dimensional creatures made primarily of stone probably deserved her vacations. Bones was making "I need to see you now" motions with his eyes, though. Jim let the rest of his questions go for the moment. "Well, enjoy your stay with us, Commander." "Bones, what have you got for me?" McCoy led Jim into his inner office, and before answering, not only shut the door, but opaqued the walls. "The damnedest assortment of fairy tales, weird stories, and oddball visions you ever heard, Jim, and other problems. What good idea was she?" "I noticed a certain talent for, getting to the point," Jim said dryly as he sat down in front of Bones' desk. "But looked at another way, she was doing her job. You've been twigging me about my weight for a month now." "That's not the point." "What is?" McCoy reached over to his desk, picked up a cassette, and dropped it into a slot. The screen embedded in the desktop came alive and started reading out the new crewman's service record. "Burke, Leah T., Lieutenant Commander, RN, ND, MA, EXMT, FICN. "Look at that," Bones said, waving his hands in the air in exasperation. "I sent for a nurse, not alphabet soup." Jim shrugged. "So she's good at her job." He glanced up. "She is good at her job." "That's the problem, Jim. She's very, very good. She's too good. Nurses like that start wanting to be doctors, or start acting like them. Why can't I just once get a nurse that knows how to be one?" "All I'm Bones," Jim said, tapping the table and blacking it out. "What happened to you during transit?" McCoy stopped dead and favored Jim with a long, annoyed, rueful look. "You should have gone into psych." He sat down behind the desk. "Jim," he said very slowly, "I've been sick a few times in my life, sick enough to have hallucinations. I know what they feel like. But never have I experienced so vivid that makes this," and he pounded his fist on the tabletop, "feel like the hallucination instead of the reality." He stared moodily at the fist and the table. "Ever since we came out, I keep expecting to walk through things like a ghost, because I was somewhere so much more real and solid than physical reality that I could see through my hands, couldn't touch or move anything." The voice dropped. "The country, I don't know where it was, it burned my eyes. The edges on everything were as sharp as shadows in space. Colors were almost torment. Stars would have looked pastel by comparison. It was a terrible place." He looked up at Jim, then wonder and fear in his face. "And I'd give anything I could think of to get back there again." Very slowly, Jim nodded. To his own surprise and dismay, the same thought about his own experience had occurred to him. "The rest of the crew?" he said. "Similar." McCoy picked up another tape, dropped it in the slot. Readout flowed across the table. "Leaving out details, as much for confidentiality as anything else, Jim. Some of these visions, experiences, whatever, were pretty private. The vast majority of the crew had hypersensory experiences of events or places they had never seen before. The surprise was that some of those are identifiable, planetary environments envisioned in such detail that it seems impossible for the person not to have physically been in that place. Some are places we're unable to presently identify. Some people seem to see things that happened in the past, events we've been able to confirm via the computer that the people involved knew nothing about. I checked a random sampling with a neuroscan, by the way. Bones said as Jim opened his mouth to say something about unconscious memory of events heard about or studied and forgotten. Pattern search revealed no neurons imprinted with relevant references except the ones involved in the experience itself. The people really hadn't heard of these events. The common factors among all the reported experiences are initial discomfort, secondary, I think, to everyone's perception of loss of duration, and extreme vividness of experience, to the point where physical reality seems insufficient or temporarily ephemeral on recovery. Oh, and one other. Perception of the experience as desirable, even if it wasn't exactly pleasant at the time, and a desire to return to it. A few people made the distinction that it wasn't the experience specifically they decided to re-enter, but the background, the context, and the emotions inspired in them. He touched a spot on the desk and a recorded voice spoke. Uhura's. The whole thing, she said, her voice quiet and pensive, would have broken your heart. Why? Said Leah Burke's voice, equally quiet. Was it so sad? Sad? No, said Uhura, and the joy and longing in her voice was astonishing to hear. Evaluation, Jim said. Are these experiences going to impair the crew's ability to function? McCoy shook his head. I have no idea, Jim. I see no such impairment at present, but some of them might be covering. How are you doing? Well enough. You might as well add mine to the assortment, Jim told McCoy about what it was like to be a starship. Bones sat quite still, nodding occasionally until Jim was done. So what do you prescribe, Doctor? Work, McCoy said sourly. I'm finding it very effective. When are we jumping again? Half a day or so. Well enough. Warn them first. Well, you would anyway, I know. Maybe it'll be easier the second time. Bones sighed. We're working with an unknown here, Jim. I don't see any dangerous trends yet. I'll let you know if I do. Meanwhile, I'm trapped in a sick bay full of killer nurses. Christine's training Burke, isn't she? Supposedly, Bones said, sounding worried. But sometimes I wonder who's training who and what. Such syntax. I'm a surgeon, damn it, not a grammarian. They got up and headed for the door together. It hissed open to reveal Myre Sagati talking to Leah Burke, while Ensign Dehenish stood by. What's wrong with you, then? McCoy said to the Sadrayo. Nothing, sir. Nothing? No, sir. I'm just here to hold Lieutenant Sagati's paw. During transit, she's having one of those experiences. That was as close as a Sadrayo could get to past tense. And you didn't? No, sir. Dehenish trailed off in an apprehension as McCoy advanced on him. Come this way, my boy. You come right this way. I have a machine that would love to meet you. Several machines. It's not hurting, is it? Dehenish said rather plaintively as Bones led him away. The Sadrayo looked over his shoulder at Jim and threw him a look like that of a small child asking to be rescued from a mad dentist. Jim shrugged at him, not without sympathy. Let me know what happens, Bones, he said, and turned to leave sickbay. I will, Captain. Right over here, son. Now, you tell the nice computer all about it. Christine, show Leah how to set up the synapse synchronization metafile. Thanks, Chris. I know how. Doesn't he ever say please? Jim went quickly away to snatch a few hours' sleep before the next jump. The ship was on red alert when he woke up. That was no surprise, he had ordered it. The ship's complement would have rearranged itself with the addition of Epsilon ship to Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta. Watches would be shorter, 1 in 5 rather than 1 in 4, and the crew would be sharp and ready for whatever Inversion might bring. He got up and dressed in a hurry and made for the bridge. Spock was there, as might have been expected, pacing around the railed circle and inspecting everything with his usual cool thoroughness. As the lift doors opened, he stepped up toward them and met Jim near the science station. Everything all right? Yes, sir. We're ready to leave orbit around Zeta 10 Scorpii as soon as you give the word. Which, if I may say so, I would be gratified if you do quickly. The star's spectrum is not showing any sign I can clearly diagnose, but there again are irregularities that have disturbing implications. All right, we'll be out of here shortly. Did you check the computers? I did, Captain. According to all our standard diagnostics, and some non-standard ones of my own devising, the damage control computers are working perfectly. I am at a loss to explain the failure as regards to the flaw Mr. Scott found in the port himself. Damn, Jim said, making his way down to the command chair. Chekhov was at the helm, but Sulu was not. This was his off-ship, and his apprentice navigator, Lieutenant Hemming, was handling navigations. Absently, Jim nodded them both and sat down. "Spock," he said as he did so, "if we have to do hands-on checks of everything, it's going to slow us down quite a bit. Captain, I concur. Yet it seems the only way to proceed safely until I can determine the cause for the failure of the diagnostics." Jim grimaced. "All right." He hit the comm button on the engineering chair as Spock went back to his station. "Engineering. Kittlick here, Captain. Where's Scotty?" "Making final checks, sir. More out of nerves than anything else, I think. He pronounced both warp drive and impulse engines clean hours ago. The reweave of the injured hull section was completed 2 shifts back." "Is the inversion apparatus up?" "Online and ready, Captain. Course laid in for the midway hang point, halfway between the outer boundaries of the galaxy and of the Lesser Magellanic. X minus 45 degrees Gal latitude, Y 299 degrees Gal longitude, Z 101,237 light-years from the arbitrary galactic core. Navigations, please confirm." Jim smiled. She was taking no chances this time and making sure he knew it. "Navcom confirms, Captain," Mr. Hemming said. "Good enough, Kittlick. Have Scotty get back on post. We're about to jump." "Aye, sir. Engineering out. Sick bay." "McCoy here. Ready, Bones? If you mean are we prepared for jump, yes. If you mean am I happy about it?" He didn't finish the sentence, but his tone of voice made it plain how he felt. "I finished with the scans on Dehenish, by the way." "And?" "The machine confirms it. He is the only crew member other than Kittlick to sustain no inversion experience. I've got him hooked up to the neuroscan so we can get live data on what happens in inversion. Leah's hooked up too. I just wish we had another Sadrao." "I have a few wishes on my own, most of them having to do with non-functioning computers. Keep an eye on your machinery, Bones. Bridge out." He turned to Lieutenant Mahaze, who was holding down Uhura's post. "We'll count it down, Mr. Mahaze. 5 minutes from now. Mark." "Counting, sir." "Confirm red alert statuses on all duty stations, personnel presence and readiness." It took a few moments. "Confirmed, Captain." "Good. Give me all call." Mahaze touched a light, nodded at Jim. "All hands, this is the captain," he said. "At 4 minutes, 40 seconds from now, we will go into inversion mode. Grab hold of whatever you need to grab hold of and hang on. We're going to come out a long way from home. Kirk out." He sat back in the chair, breathed in and out, and looked at his bridge crew. There had been times before that he seemed to justify the old cliché about tension in a bridge being thick enough to cut with a phaser. This was another. Just raising a hand to scratch an itch cost Jim more effort than was natural. The air seemed stiff. 3 minutes, 30 seconds, Mahaze said. Jim wanted to swear, to jump up, to walk around, to do something. His crew sat quietly around him and did their jobs, making it look easy in a murmur of calm voices. Solid cameras rolling. Hollows up. Shields positive. 1 minute, 30 seconds. The screen burned with a violent and lovely image of Zeta 10 Scorpii, nested deep in the eye-searing indigo and violet shells. Jim looked at it long and hard by way of distraction, shifting his eyes away only when they began to hurt. Defense departments. Phasers hot. Photon torpedoes, tubes loaded. 45 seconds. The star was broiling and bubbling with sunspots. Jim wondered if these were a symptom of the irregularity Spock had mentioned. Certainly the star had a rather active photosphere, but that could be expected with a sun that blew off the upper layers of his atmosphere every now and then. Log entries, complete and transmitted. 15 seconds. 14. 13. Warp drive, temporarily disabled. Impulse engines at 0.15C. 9. 8. 7. Inversion drive, online, double confirm. 4. 3. 2. 1. Inversion implement. And the world started to go away. Amazing, Jim thought. And the thought didn't feel at all normal. You can actually feel it coming a little, like anesthesia. That was almost the only true thought he had time for. Next moment, the lack of duration choked him again, and it was harder to bear this time, not easier. But the last thing he saw, while still being able to think and see, made him want to start right out of his seat, except he couldn't move. The surface of Zeta 10 Scorpii heaved and writhed like liquid that's had a weight dropped into it, then lost its shape and spread out and out and out in a frightful, splendid, deadly flower of fire, pursuing them in an incandescent rage as 109 Pessium had. Oh no! Jim managed to think before time stopped and held everything still, even his thoughts. Not again, and not this star. I think when we get home I'm going to get yelled at. And Enterprise and the universe were gone again.
Jeff and Rick present Unpacking the Power of Power Pack,
where we journey through each issue of the most underrated Marvel series of the 80s while drinking beer,
analyzing awesome and amazing adolescent adventures, and absorbing alcohol.
We got kids with powers, we got villains with attitude.
We got superhero guests, like all of them from the Marvel Universe.
We have thematically appropriate beer reviews.
We have good jokes and bad song parodies.
One stop for all your Power Pack pod-pleasing procurements.
And we got alliteration.
Find Unpacking the Power of Power Pack wherever fine podcasts are played.
Costumes on.
Just my quick thoughts about Chapter 6. First of all, I hope I didn't offend too much with my bastardization of Scotty's accent, and I hope that my McCoy was okay. I did like the conversation between Killick and Scotty about how the inversion drive works a little bit. In the pre-technobabble days, it's interesting to see actual physics concepts used. You know, they're kind of funny money physics, but they at least have some sort of grounding in reality so that you can read it and have an idea in your head that this thing that they're putting on the ship works in a certain way. I also was a big fan of the characterization of McCoy in his conversation with Jim about his experiences during the inversion. You really got the sense that these two were very good friends, and that Leonard was sharing something with Jim that he wouldn't easily be able to share with anyone else. It's a testament to the very strong friendship that these two characters have. And I really, really got a kick out of the Hamalki evolution and sex life discussion. It was really funny that they managed to do it while, lampshading the fact that Jim Kirk is the ladies' man, and also gives a little bit of truth to the idea that I say that the Star Trek things that we see are propaganda films, and that these books are what really happens, which I say jokingly, in that Jim doesn't quite seduce as many people as is normally depicted. And actually, if you really watch the show from beginning to end, he doesn't get it on with as many women, particularly as many green women, as is typically thought in the public consciousness. So I thought that was a nice little nod to that. But to actually create this completely alien mating ritual, which is wrapped up in their concept of how their reproductive system works, and they have a bunch of religious aspects all thrown together. That is really interesting, and it also highlights the infinite diversity and infinite combinations aspect that is so key and core to Star Trek. Kirk was able to listen to this description of something which on the surface sounds horrifying. I mean, the male Hamalki is killed during the nuptial process, but it's an alien culture that is, they're spiders, and they're spiders that have gained sapience, and not every alien creature or culture is going to have the same set of social norms and mores as humans would have. And that would be an interesting philosophical debate to have. I also like the fact that religion is also depicted as existing in the future. I know Gene Roddenberry was a huge atheist and humanist and thought that by the 23rd and 24th centuries there wouldn't be any sort of worship of a deity left, which is, despite my own feelings on that or my own wishes on that, it's a very naive thought. Religion has maintained for centuries on this planet alone, and to think that that would just go away due to a certain enlightenment is not really paying much attention to how history has unfolded, and ignores the aspects of religion which are useful to society and different societies. So that's always nice to see a take on that sort of thing. That's done neutrally. It's not making a statement on religion one way or another. It's just establishing a plausible situation that exists in the 23rd century. I'll have a lot more to say about the Hamalki mating situation, but I don't want to spoil some things that are coming up later, and I will definitely talk with the other two about that at the very end of it all. So that's about all I have for this chapter. Stay tuned for future chapters by Layne, Maggie, and myself. And stay safe and live long and prosper.